She was 22 years old, alone in a town she had never heard of before last Tuesday, and she had exactly $6 left to her name. In one coat pocket was a worn handkerchief, soft at the folds from years of use. In the other was a bone folder, a long, flat tool of polished ivory, smooth from decades of careful hands, etched along one edge with the initials WB. It had belonged to her grandmother. It was all she had left of her. The men at the municipal auction laughed when she raised her hand for the sunken old Cooperage on Alder Creek. They laughed freely, the way men do when they are certain they are right. But what nobody in that yard understood, what nobody in Harrow Falls, Ontario had thought to consider, was that the young woman standing quietly at the edge of that crowd was not bidding on a ruin. She was bidding on what she knew was hidden inside one. We at Cottage Stories love to hear where these stories find you. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and settle in close. This one matters. Prudence Winifred Langton, Prue to everyone who knew her, had not always been alone. She had grown up above a narrow bookbinding shop on a side street in Guelph, Ontario, in the care of her grandmother, Winifred Bray. Winifred was a small, fine-boned woman who smelled of paste and leather, and occasionally, of the strong black tea she kept steeping on the workbench stove. She had a calm voice and careful hands, and she had been binding books since before Prue's mother was born. She ran her shop without hurry and without apology, and she had built a modest, honest living from it over 40 years. Winifred had no grand theories about life. She had a few principles, stated simply and often. Good work is its own argument. A joint made right needs no ornament. And the one Prue heard most, always look at the seams. The story of a thing, Winifred said, is told in how it's put together. She taught Prue everything. Not just the craft, the folding and cutting, the pressing and pasting, the particular satisfaction of a spine that opens flat, but the eye behind the craft. How to read the grain of a piece of leather. How to feel with one finger whether a seam was true or merely painted over. How to use the bone folder not just to score a crease, but to listen to what a surface was trying to tell you. The ivory tool had been Winifred's own, passed down from her teacher before her. And when she first placed it in Prue's hand, Prue was 9, and the tool was nearly as long as her forearm. She said, simply, "This is how you ask a thing what it's made of." They had a small life, the two of them, but it was a whole one. And then, in the second week of October, a chill settled into Winifred's chest that the doctor said was pneumonia, and within a fortnight she was gone. Prue was 22 years old, and the world had gone quiet in a way she had not known it could. The trouble came swiftly after the grief. Winifred had owned the shop and the rooms above it, but the building sat on a leasehold lot, and the lease, Prue discovered only after the funeral, had been co-signed years ago by Winifred's son, Prue's uncle Victor. Victor Bray was a man who had never visited the shop in Prue's memory, who sent letters at Christmas and nothing more. He arrived 3 weeks after the burial with a solicitor at his elbow and a businesslike expression on his face. He had already found a buyer for the equipment and a new tenant for the rooms. He was not cruel about it. That was almost worse. He handed her $40, her grandmother's small savings, which he could have kept entirely under the lease, and told her she had 2 weeks to find other arrangements. He did not ask her where she would go. He did not seem to wonder. Prue paid a month of that $40 on a room in Guelph, then spent 3 weeks looking for work she didn't find. A woman trained in bookbinding was a narrow thing to be in a city where the large printing houses hired men by preference. The small stationery shops had no positions. She wrote 3 letters to binderies in Toronto and received no replies. By the time 5 weeks had passed, she had $6 remaining and a single trunk. Her clothes, her grandmother's small collection of craft books, a handful of tools she'd managed to keep, and the bone folder, which she had tucked into her coat pocket the morning of the funeral and had not removed since. She boarded a train heading north and west, with no particular destination, only the understanding that a smaller town might have more room for a person willing to work with her hands. She disembarked at Harrow Falls because the name sounded like a place where something might catch. She found a room at a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Enid Sproul, a woman of few words and reliably hot porridge, who asked nothing beyond whether Prue could pay a week in advance. Prue could, just barely. She took the room. It was Mrs. Sproul who mentioned the municipal auction 3 days after Prue arrived. There was a notice at the post office, she said, tapping the table with one finger. Delinquent properties and unclaimed assets. End of the month. Prue went, not because she had any real plan, but because she had run out of other things to do. It was the kind of morning where the alternative was sitting in her room watching the street and feeling her $6 grow lighter simply by existing. The auction was held in the yard behind the town hall, under a sky the color of old pewter. 30 men or so had gathered, their breath showing in the October air, their boots crunching on frost-stiffened grass. They were farmers, merchants, mill hands from the creek operations downstream. Prue stood at the outer edge and tried to be invisible, which came easily enough. The auctioneer, a red-faced man named Alderman Prosser, who wore a coat 2 sizes too large and seemed to enjoy his own voice, worked through a list of unclaimed lots and abandoned equipment. A broken hay rake, a parcel of rotted fence posts, a swayback mare nobody bid on twice. Then he came to the final item. Lot 14, he announced, sweeping his arm toward the creek. One Cooperage building and associated property on Alder Creek, delinquent on municipal taxes for 11 years. Offered as its where is. Removal or repair at the buyer's sole responsibility. A ripple of amusement moved through the crowd. The Cooperage on Alder Creek was a local embarrassment, a half-collapsed barrel-making workshop that had been sinking slowly into the creek bank for over a decade. One corner had dropped entirely, pulling the roofline into an angle that made it look ashamed of itself. The siding was black with mould. Prue had walked past it her first morning in Harrow Falls, and noted it mainly because it looked to be in the process of returning itself to the earth. "Who'll open the bidding?" Prosser called out, grinning at his own joke, on this fine piece of Harrow Falls heritage. $2, someone shouted, and got a laugh. $2.50, called another man, for the firewood. $3. Prue was not looking at the collapsed corner or the hanging door. She was looking at the roof beams, what she could see of them through the gaps in the rotten siding. They were pale and close-grained, even in color. White oak, if she was reading it right. She had handled enough oak boards in her grandmother's shop to know its character. White oak did not rot the way pine did. It could cup and warp if you abused it, but it did not hollow out from the inside. If those beams were oak, they were still sound. She looked at the foundation stones. Cut granite, not fieldstone. Whoever had built this Cooperage had not built something temporary. They had quarried proper stone and set it on proper footings. The walls were ruined. The bones were something else entirely. She thought of Winifred. Always look at the seams. Her hand went into her coat pocket. The bone folder was cool and smooth against her fingers. Prosser looked around the crowd for any final bid. $4. Prue stepped forward. Her voice came out clear and steady, though she could not have said exactly how. $6, she said. The silence was immediate. Then the laughter came, slower, more genuine than the laughter at the Cooperage itself. It was the particular sound of a crowd that believes it has witnessed a foolish thing. Several men turned to look at her properly. A young woman in a gray wool coat, standing alone, her hand in her pocket. Their expressions ranged from pity to scorn, to, in 1 or 2 cases, a straightforward bewilderment. Prosser recovered himself. $6 from the young lady. He didn't bother hiding his smirk. Going once, going twice, he scanned the crowd of grinning faces. Sold to the young lady for $6. The gavel came down. A man near the front said something to his neighbor that Prue couldn't hear, and they both shook their heads. She walked to the clerk's table and laid out her $6, every coin she had. The clerk, a thin man with ink-stained fingers, counted them without looking at her and handed her the bill of sale. She folded it and put it in her pocket beside the bone folder, turned, and walked away. The sound of the men's laughter followed her for half a block. The walk to Alder Creek took 10 minutes through the back streets of town. The wind off the creek carried the smell of mud and iron and standing water. She found the Cooperage at the end of a short lane, half hidden by willows that had grown up around it in the years of its abandonment. Up close, it was worse than it had looked from the road. The collapsed corner had pulled one wall outward, and the floor in that section had buckled and heaved. The door groaned on a single hinge when she pushed it open. Inside, the smell was of rot and old water and something beneath it, linseed oil. The particular, familiar smell of a place where things had been made. She stood in the doorway and let her eyes adjust. The collapsed corner was bad, but it was one corner. The rest of the floor was warped but intact, the boards stained dark with years of damp but not punched through, and the roof beams, she could see them clearly now, were exactly what she had thought. White oak, pale and even, the walls were ruined. The skeleton was something else. Along the far wall, buried under years of fallen plaster, old sacking, and a heap of rusted barrel hoops, she could just make out the edge of a workbench. long and heavy, bolted to the studs. She crossed to it carefully, testing each board before she committed her weight and began clearing the debris. It took the better part of the morning. She was not alone for all of it. An hour into the work, she heard boots on the lane and looked up to find a man in his late 30s standing in the doorway. Broad-shouldered, dark-haired, with the look of someone who spent most of his time outdoors. He held his cap in both hands. He was not smiling. His name was Callum Dewar, he said. He was the head carpenter at the hatch mill downstream. He had watched her at the auction. He had not laughed. "I know what white oak looks like," he said, by way of explanation. He stood a moment, then set his cap back on and moved past her to the collapsed corner, crouching to examine where the wall plate had pulled away from the stone footing. "This is fixable," he said, as though reading a weather report. He did not ask permission to help. He simply stayed and began working on the corner while she worked on the bench. It struck her as the most practical form of kindness she had encountered in a long time. By midday, the workbench was fully clear. It was a magnificent piece, heavy pine, the top a single slab nearly 8 feet long, every inch of it bearing the history of the work that had been done there. Adze marks, Cooper's chisel cuts, the rings of oil cans, and the stains of iron filings, worked into the grain like a record of everything that had ever been made at that bench. She ran her hands along the front edge, the way Winifred had taught her to read a piece of furniture, slowly, with the pads of her fingers, not her palms. And there, along the bottom edge of the lower panel, a seam, so fine it was nearly invisible, running in a perfectly straight horizontal line for about 18 inches. Too straight to be a crack, too deliberate to be accidental. She took the bone folder from her pocket. The tool was slim enough to fit into the finest crease in a leather binding, precise enough to find the edge of a hidden joint in a book spine. She pressed the pointed tip gently into the seam and drew it slowly along the line. The wood held for 12 inches, and then, a fraction of movement, a give that was not the wood settling, something engineered. She pressed her thumb along the lower edge of the panel. A faint, definite click. The panel swung open on a hidden wooden pivot hinge, smooth on its axis despite the years, revealing a narrow hollow space in the base of the bench. She went still. Winifred had taught her that too. When you find something significant, don't rush it. Inside the hollow sat a flat tin box, sealed around its lid with black wax gone hard as stone. It was heavy when she lifted it out. She carried it to the doorway, where the gray October light was clearest, and sat down on the threshold with the box in her lap. Callum Dewar had come to stand nearby, watching, his expression carefully neutral. She used the thin edge of the bone folder to break the wax seal and pry the lid open. Inside, wrapped in a square of oilcloth, was a packet of papers tied with a faded green ribbon. Beneath them, a small leather pouch, its drawstring knotted tight. She untied the ribbon and unfolded each document one by one, smoothing the stiff, age-yellowed pages against her knee. The first was a crown grant. A formal, stamped document from the province of Ontario, dated 1869, granting to one Simeon Rudd, Cooper, the freehold title to a parcel of land on Alder Creek, together with all riparian rights thereto, meaning the right to use and control the water at that bend of the creek, including its use for any mill or manufacturing purpose. The second was a surveyor's map, hand-drawn with extraordinary care, showing the exact boundaries of the parcel. The Cooperage building sat within it. So did the creek bend. So did the mill race channel that 3 downstream operations, including the Hatch Mill, had been drawing from for the better part of 20 years. There were lien papers, legal correspondence, a copy of a letter from a solicitor, and at the bottom of the stack a single folded sheet of paper. She opened it carefully. The handwriting was neat and deliberate, the pen strokes of a man who had written slowly and with great intention. To whoever opens this box, October 1872, my name is Simeon Rudd. I built this cooperage in 1868 with my own hands and my own savings, and I hold the crown grant for this land and the creek rights that belong to it. I am not a man of wealth, and I am not a man of many words, but I know what I hold, and I know what the Belmore Land Company wants to take from me. They made an offer. When I refused, they began having my taxes assessed at a rate I cannot sustain. They have friends in this town and I do not, and their solicitor is better paid than mine. I cannot fight them at law. What I can do is hide what I hold and trust someone else to hold it after me. By my reading of the crown grant and the riparian title, the freehold and the water rights cannot be separated. They are one property under the original grant. Whoever holds clear title to this land holds title to the creek rights. The mills downstream have been paying easement fees to Belmore for years. Those fees belong to the Crown grant holder. They have always belonged to the Crown grant holder. Belmore never had a sound claim to collect them. I have no son or daughter to leave this to. I have no one to carry on the fight. But I built this bench from white oak and set this building on granite footings, and I believe it will stand long after Belmore and Sons is nothing but a name on a bad debt. I am hiding these papers where any person with patience and a careful eye will find them. I hope that person is honest. I hope they are willing to work hard. I hope they are not afraid of what is rightly theirs. The creek is a good creek. It ought to belong to someone who will use it well. I leave this not as a grievance, but as a gift. There is $40 in the pouch, which is all I have left. I believe it may be enough to make a start. Use it wisely. Build something that lasts. Simeon Rudd. Prue read the letter twice, her eyes moving carefully over the precise, deliberate handwriting. The words of this man she had never met. This stranger from 20 years before, who had built on quarried stone and trusted his work to outlast his enemies, spoke directly to something she had been carrying for weeks without a name for it. She set the letter down on her knee and looked out at the creek. The willows were trailing their last yellow leaves into the current. A gray heron stood motionless on the far bank, watching the water. She thought of Winifred. She thought of the bone folder in her hand, the initials WB, catching the thin afternoon light. She thought of the phrase she had heard so many times that it had become the rhythm of her own breathing, always look at the seams. And then, for the first time since the morning of her grandmother's funeral, she wept, not from sorrow and not from self-pity. She wept from the particular, overwhelming relief of a person who has been holding herself upright alone for a very long time and has found, against all reasonable expectation, that there is solid ground beneath her feet after all. Callum Dewar sat down quietly on the other side of the doorway and said nothing, which was exactly right. When she was steady again, she opened the leather pouch. $40 in coins and small bills, slightly damp, still entirely real. She folded Simeon Rudd's letter, placed it back in the tin box with the rest of the documents, and held the box close. The laughter of the auction yard felt like something from a different lifetime. The next morning, Prue went looking for a lawyer. Mrs. Sproul directed her, without hesitation, to Helen Scobie, whose office was above the pharmacy on Main Street. She was sharp, Mrs. Sproul said, and she did not work cheap. But she was the only person in Harrow Falls who had ever successfully contested a Belmore land decision, and that had established her reputation permanently. Helen Scobie was in her early 40s, with close-cropped gray hair and reading spectacles she wore, pushed up on her forehead when she wasn't actively reading. She listened to Prue's account with the focused stillness of a person who has learned to hear everything before she says anything. When Prue laid out the documents on the desk, Helen put her spectacles on and read in silence for a long time. Finally, she set the papers down. "Miss Langton," she said, "this is the cleanest Crown grant I have read in 15 years of practice. The riparian title is unambiguous. The lien structure is sound, and Belmore and Sons dissolved in 1891. They were never the lawful assignee of Rudd's rights in any case. They were simply large enough that no one had challenged them." She paused. "The mills have been paying into a pocket with no lawful hand in it. The moment you register this title, every one of those payments becomes a matter of clear record." She said it the way Callum Dewar had said the building was fixable, calmly, as a plain statement of fact. They went to the county registry office the following morning, Prue and Helen Scobie side by side. The clerk looked up when they came in. He was the same man who had counted Prue's $6 at the auction table, and his expression, when he recognized her, arranged itself into something close to condescension. Helen Scobie placed the Crown grant on the counter. "We're here to register a title transfer," she said, in the tone of a person who has done this many times and found it unremarkable. "Alder Creek parcel, Simeon Rudd grant, 1869. New holder, Prudence Winifred Langton." The clerk's expression changed. He picked up the grant. He looked at it for a long time. He called his supervisor over in a low voice, and there was a hushed exchange in which the words Belmore and riparian were audible. The supervisor went to check the registry himself, came back, checked again, and then stood for a moment looking at the documents with the expression of a man who had expected to find an error and had not found one. An hour later, Prue walked out of the registry office with freshly stamped deeds in her name. The news spread through Harrow Falls, the way news always moves in a small town. quickly, incompletely, and with a fair amount of embellishment. Within a week, the men who had laughed at the auction had little to say about it in public, and found it sat poorly enough when they said it in private. The legal victory was quiet and absolute. But Prue knew, as she had known from the beginning, that a deed on paper was not yet a living thing. The Cooperage was still half collapsed. The creek rights were hers, but only if she could make something of them. The work had to start. She put $20 of Simeon Rudd's 40 toward materials, timber, nails, glazing for the 2 windows, new hinges for the door, and went back to Alder Creek to begin. Callum Dewar arrived the next morning with his toolbox. He set it down without comment, as he had the first time, and went straight to work on the collapsed corner. He explained things as he worked: how to read the load in a roof beam, how to jack a sill plate back to level, how to repoint a stone foundation properly so it would hold for another generation. He was a patient teacher, precise and plain-spoken, and Prue found she learned quickly when the lesson was attached to an immediate physical task. She worked alongside him, and her grandmother's training served her better than she might have predicted. The fine motor patience of bookbinding, the ability to hold something in alignment for a long time, to work slowly toward a true right angle, translated well into framing and joining. Callum said once, watching her set a brace, that she had a carpenter's hands. She understood it as the highest compliment he knew how to give. Others came. A woman from the far end of town named Rosemary Bent, who ran a small dry goods counter, arrived one afternoon with a pot of soup and half a loaf of bread. "A body can't set joists on nothing," she said simply, and from then on appeared twice a week with food, asking nothing beyond a report on the progress. The blacksmith, a quiet Scotsman named Fergus Muir, came by to look at the iron barrel hoops rusting in the corner, and without being asked, began sorting through them for any that could be salvaged into brackets. He refused payment. He said only that he had known Simeon Rudd long ago, and left it at that. The kindness, delivered with such gruffness, stayed with Prue for a long time after. Helen Scobie came by on Sunday afternoons to see how things were going, sometimes bringing with her a younger woman from her office who was studying law by correspondence and wanted to understand, she said, what a riparian claim looked like in real life. The mill owners took a week to formally acknowledge the new title. 2 of the 3 paid what was owed without much argument once Helen's letters arrived. The 3rd required a more detailed conversation, but in the end, the law was the law, and the Crown grant was the Crown grant, and even the most resistant man could read plainly what the documents said. By the first snowfall, the Cooperage stood level and tight-roofed. It smelled of fresh-cut pine and linseed oil, and, faintly still, of the barrels that had been made there for years before Prue was born. She built shelves along the long wall and moved her grandmother's craft books onto them. She set up her bindery in the back half of the space, using the old workbench, its secret hollow now empty, its hidden door left propped open on purpose, a small quiet gesture she couldn't quite name, as her primary work surface. She bound her first commission that December, a set of church registers for a parish 3 towns over, who had heard of her through Helen Scobie. The work was careful and clean, entirely Winifred's teaching, applied to entirely her own hands. She invoiced them, and when the payment arrived, she sat with the check on the workbench beside the bone folder for a moment, before she did anything else. This is how it begins, she thought. This is exactly how it begins. By the following spring, Harrow Falls had stopped calling her the young woman from the auction. They called her Miss Langton at the registry office, and at the mill offices when the quarterly payments came through. Down on Alder Creek, where the willows were coming in green, and the gray heron was back on the far bank, they called her Prue, and that was the name she preferred. On the 1-year anniversary of the auction, she stood in the doorway of the Cooperage in the pale October light. The creek was high with autumn rain. The willows were gold. She had the bone folder in her hand, turning it slowly between her fingers the way she always did when she was thinking. The initials WB caught the light and held it. She thought of Simeon Rudd, who had built this place with his own hands and hidden his hope in the joints of a workbench, trusting that someone with a careful eye would find it one day. She thought of Winifred, who had spent 40 years teaching a girl to look at the seams of things and understand what held them. She thought of $6 and a laughing crowd and a derelict building sinking into the mud of Alder Creek. The men who had laughed were not her concern any longer. They had laughed at what they could see. They had not looked at the seams. The creek was hers. The Cooperage was hers. The work she was building, one commission at a time, belonged to her completely. And none of it had come from luck, or from the charity of anyone who had believed in her before she proved herself worth believing in. It had come from knowing how to look, from knowing what a sound joint felt like beneath a careful thumb, from a bone folder, and from the woman who had taught her to use it. Here at Cottage Stories, we find ourselves thinking about you, out there wherever you're watching from tonight. We all carry something left to us by someone we've lost. A way of seeing, a habit of the hands, a voice that still speaks when we most need to slow down and pay attention. What is it for you? What did someone teach you to see that you might never have noticed on your own? Tell us in the comments. We read every single one. We'll see you next time.